Good afternoon, evening, or whenever you're watching this. Because we have a shortened block tomorrow, we only have 45 minutes. We are going to kind of use our class time to focus on source analysis, and so I've recorded this lecture to cover what I would have talked about in the actual class. So here's our warm-up passage here. This is from John F. Kennedy's first inaugural in 1961. We talked about the election of Kennedy last class. And so let's take a look at this, thinking about main idea, HIP, and conclusions we can draw. He says, "We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief in the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place, to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty." Right, so I want you to think for a minute, right, the main idea of this. Right, there's very clearly a kind of anti-communism here, a kind of linking of the type of anti-communism of the Cold War to the American project, right? That there's a direct connection from the principles of the Declaration of Independence to the anti-communism that was popular, as we see, among both Republicans and Democrats, right? There's also this element of change here, the emphasis on youth, right? That there's a new generation of Americans taking the helm here, signified by Kennedy. If we're thinking about the audience, right, his audience is the American people, right? This is his inaugural address. He's kind of setting the tone for his presidential administration, but it's clear that he also has a foreign audience, right? That just because he's younger, right, just because he's a Democrat, shouldn't be considered as weak, that he's committing publicly to the world on his kind of anti-communist bona fides. So today we're going to be talking about the first of two classes on the 60s and really focusing on what we can call the triumph of modern American liberalism. So we are going to be looking at pretty much from 1960 to 1965 is the purview of our class period today, and we're going to start with this idea of Camelot in the Kennedy administration. So Kennedy is himself one of the youngest people to hold the office of presidency. His wife, Jacqueline, is quite beautiful, right? He has affairs with Marilyn Monroe, but the entire kind of idea here is there's this exusion of youth, of vitality, of vigor, right? That is kind of propelling the nation forward, right? The kind of sex symbol of Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe is actually kind of plays into the part of this, right? We are moving beyond kind of the old and we're entering the new, right? But Kennedy really, really is an anti-communist, right? His view of the entire world view is through the lens of anti-communism, right? And so this is pretty clear in kind of all of his works, right? Including things that don't really seem like they are necessarily anti-communist, right? This is to be seen in the Peace Corps, right? Which sent young Americans to assist economic development and educational work in developing countries, right? The space program, the moon race, the kind of race to get to the moon, right? Was viewed as part of a beat the Soviets to the moon after the Soviets launched that first satellite Sputnik, right? And they were successful, right? In 1969, you have the moon landing. Kennedy also formed a new Latin American policy, the Alliance for Progress, which was modeled off the Marshall Plan but was significantly smaller, but the idea was to fight what he viewed was the spread of communism in America's own backyard, by providing kind of funding. Now, mostly what happens is you had rent-seeking from local elites and military regimes, and it didn't actually alleviate poverty. But Cuba is really where we kind of see the key anti-communist focus of Kennedy, right? In 1959, Fidel Castro successfully led forces that overthrew the regime of the Cuban dictator Batista, and under Batista, Cuba had been an economic dependency of the United States, right? And this goes all the way back to the Platt Amendment in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. And when Castro's government starts to nationalize Americans' lands and investments to sell sugar to the Soviet Union, Castro himself was like a leftist revolutionary. Eisenhower stopped trade with the island, and the CIA began to train anti-Castro exiles for an invasion. Kennedy gives the green light to this in April of 1961 and lets the CIA invade the Bay of Pigs, right? Kind of building on what we talked about last class with the CIA's kind of efforts to instigate coups and popular rebellions like they did in Iran, like they did in Guatemala, right? To rid the regime. The mission was a colossal failure, and it actually pushes Cuba closer into the Soviet sphere of influence. The Kennedy tried assassinations of Castro, and it failed, and Castro would hold on to it until his control of Cuba until his death. And it's really, really worsened over the course of his presidency. And in 1961, the Soviets built a wall separating the two parts of Berlin that would be this like enduring symbol of the division in Europe in the Cold War. And in October of 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union was installing missiles in Cuba that were capable of delivering nuclear-armed warheads to American cities. The administration basically refused to accept that these were present, and the military in the United States was really pushing for Kennedy to launch an invasion of Cuba, right? That would have triggered probably World War and nuclear exchange, right? The Soviets would have likely attacked Berlin. There would have been kind of potential use of nuclear weapons, and Kennedy instead imposes a military quarantine, a blockade. He called it a quarantine on the island, and demanded the removal of the missiles. There's a series of backdoor, behind-the-scenes negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev to withdraw the missiles in exchange for the U.S. basically pledging to respect Cuban sovereignty and to remove missiles that it had had in Turkey that could reach Soviet cities. This Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted for 13 days, was probably the closest the U.S. and Soviet Union came to an active nuclear war. It really diminishes Kennedy's Cold War enthusiasm, and then Kennedy starts moving a little bit more towards like a conciliatory effort, right? And then the shift is more towards civil rights and domestic politics starting in 1963, when you have more agitation around civil rights, and Kennedy actually is not. He's a kind of a reluctant supporter of civil rights. At first, he was really worried that the movement was kind of co-opted by the Communist Party. He actually kind of does not like Richard Nixon in 1960 has probably better civil rights credentials than Kennedy. But a series of protests that we're going to talk about kind of shifts Kennedy's public opinion that we cannot fight the Cold War unless we have racial inequality domestically. And so in June of 1963, he calls for a civil rights law and public accommodations. But on November 22nd, 1963, he is assassinated in Texas before that bill gets voted into law, and he dies. He dies is succeeded to the presidency by Lyndon Johnson, the Texas senator, and his vice president. This both shocked the nation and has been a kind of continual source of conspiracy theories ever since. And it's Johnson who not only takes up the civil rights kind of commitment, but also a broader commitment to what we will now kind of think of as like welfare state liberalism. So Johnson really believes in this idea of the Great Society, the idea that we can use the welfare state to kind of better American livelihood and well-beings and create the great society, create a system where there is like where all Americans of all walks of life are able to live these flourishing lives. This includes expanding programs like Medicare, which provided medical coverage for older Americans, and still does, right? Especially since our insurance system is basically tied to employment. The question was, well, like what happens to people when they are retired and they don't no longer have employer-sponsored insurance? And Medicare is supposed to provide this medical coverage for older Americans. Medicaid provides medical insurance and coverage for poor Americans. And there's also the general kind of theme of a war on poverty, so that you would get expansions of job training programs funded by the government, food stamps to aid, like federally funded programs to provide money for people in poverty to buy food, right, to sustain, right? It's little in the direct of kind of direct wealth transfers, and he was criticized by those on the left for not actually providing like direct poverty relief, like giving money to poor people. But there is this kind of emphasis on, providing job training and education and like trying to build a great society by providing a stronger social safety net. And so Johnson is running for re-election in 1964. And the Republican Party nominates Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona. This election features some of the most dramatic television ads, and so I wanted to just play these for you before we get into the election more broadly.
Hand over your heart. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Оглядывайтесь, мы вас не добили под Сталинградом, на Украине, в Беларуси.
For which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible.
Против нас и будете опять готовить нападение, мы так ухнем.
And justice for all.
I want American kids to grow up as Americans, and they will, if we have the guts to make our intentions clear. So clear they don't need translation or interpretation, just respect for a country prepared as no country in all history ever was.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
So Barry Goldwater is running on a very extreme anti-communist platform. He basically believes that welfare state liberalism is basically appeasement to the communists and to the Soviet Union. And for him, his kind of project is to kind of like a much more militaristic, a much more aggressive foreign policy. And Johnson seizes on this in what is probably one of the most famous political ads of all time.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So in the 1964 election, Johnson wins in a landslide, right? But there's important things here that actually matter well beyond the results of the election, right? As you can see, this is probably, we've been kind of tracking what happens here in this electoral map over the past few elections, and you can see that the Cotton Belt, right, if we're remembering back to period 4, this is really the first time, the Cotton Belt flips Republican here, and consistently here, for the first time since Reconstruction, right? Barry Goldwater wins his home state of Arizona, right? Johnson's from Texas, he wins Texas, and wins in a landslide because Goldwater was viewed as too extreme. He was viewed as like kind of an extreme conservative and extreme anti-communist, like outside of the mainstream of kind of the mainstream political consensus, which actually was kind of symbolized by someone like Dwight D. Eisenhower, where there is like generally towards free markets. We need to be kind of strategic, and we need to be anti-communist, but we were going to be like strategic about it, and we're not going to risk nuclear war. We're not going to have like spending a bunch of American blood and treasure abroad. We need to roll back the welfare state, but need to keep certain things like Social Security, a kind of willingness to use, like Goldwater was also very much against federal civil rights law that we're going to be talking about in just a second here. And so like this kind of like Eisenhower consensus in which you have like liberals and conservatives in both the Democratic and the Republican parties. It's Goldwater that begins this real ideological sorting. That Goldwater is the first time really the Republican Party nominates a real conservative, right? And this begins this process of the conservative capture of the Republican Party, where the conservatives leave the Democratic Party, liberals leave the Conservative Party, and you start seeing the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as a liberal and a conservative party, respectively. Even though Goldwater loses handedly, right? He loses by 20 million votes almost, right? That this is really the beginning of a kind of a party realignment that will occur kind of over the course of the second half of the 20th century. But the kind of thing that I haven't talked about, right, is the civil rights movement. And I want to kind of focus on with a short video on something called Freedom Riders, and then I'm going to go through a timeline on the civil rights movement. So if we're looking at the civil rights movement in the 1960s, right, we begin, like one way to kind of, like has its origins, right, in the 1950s, right? Brown versus the Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, right? The organizing of people like Dr. King in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? And this really, but it comes to a head in like 1964, 1965. In 1963, you have the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? That this was viewed as both a demand for political equality and political freedom, voting rights in particular, but also for a kind of economic self-determination, right? That they're fighting for jobs, right? This is where you have King gives the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, right? But this was really a moderated tone. This was not the aggressive militant civil rights movement. This is a kind of tone that is emphasizing on building a broad-based coalition in order to get a political victory. And it culminates, this is what puts pressure on the Kennedy administration, what will put pressure on the Johnson administration, but it's suggesting that there is a broad electoral coalition that is supportive of the civil rights laws. In 1964, kind of channeling the spirit of the fallen John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson gets the Civil Rights Act passed, and this outlaws discrimination in employment, right, and in public accommodations, right? So public accommodations like schools, hospitals, and even privately owned businesses that are open to the public, right? These would be things like restaurants, hotels, cafes, coffee shops, right? It also bans discrimination on the basis of sex, and this was actually included by the Virginia Representative Howard Smith. As you can see it, he literally goes in and while the bill is in markup, adds the word and sex, right, to these like non-discrimination clauses. And there's like significant historical debate on what exactly Smith was trying to do here. There's an argument that he was actually trying to sink the bill by attaching and sex to it because people might have been willing to vote for African-American men's equality, but not necessarily women's equality. Others are trying to argue that he was trying to smuggle in a kind of more empowering for women. But it's important to note that the Civil Rights Act includes the bans on discrimination on the grounds of race, but also on the grounds of sex. In 1964, the civil rights movement and a coalition of civil rights groups kind of turned their attention from from segregation and employment discrimination to voter discrimination, and they launched what's known as Freedom Summer. It is a coalition of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People to drive voter registrations in the South. Right, you have a series of violence against the campaign. Right, you have the bombing of the Freedom Riders buses, right? This culminates in the Selma March in 1965, where Dr. King and John Lewis lead a march across the bridge into Selma, Alabama, to register people to vote. They're beaten and abused by, and then there's national televised video and images of police dogs and fire hoses attacking peaceful protesters trying to register people to vote. And that really becomes like a turning point in the debate, leading to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has nationwide protection of voting rights, right? It has a commitment to really enforcing the 15th Amendment and ensuring that efforts to register to vote, to cast your ballot, are protected and are not going to be discriminated on the basis of race. In 1965, we also get the 24th Amendment that prohibits a poll tax, making it unconstitutional to charge people to vote. In 1965, we also get, and I apologize, I should have made that font black, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. It's also known as the Hart-Sellers Act, and this abandons from Johnson Reed in the 1920s, abandons the national origin quota. That was the immigration policy from the 20s, that there was like a percentage of the current population from that country sets the quota of people that can immigrate from the current country, and it's a shift from national origins quota towards an employment sponsorship program, right? This is employer-sponsored visas. If you want to immigrate to the United States under the INA, right, you need to have basically either a family member sponsor you or an employer sponsor you. And so in some ways, this way opens up immigration from the developing world. You have a surge in West African migration, people from Nigeria, for example. But you also have this also creates this, like, the category of an illegal alien, an undocumented immigrant, doesn't exist before this time period, right? Before you have this kind of employment-based visa program, right? And so this is actually like a watershed moment in like the history of immigration reform, immigration policy. Now, it's easy to cast this as, like I have as the title of this lecture, as Liberalism Triumphant, but at the same time, you have the seeds being sown of the conservative revival, right? So, for example, you have people like William F. Buckley, who becomes the kind of like harbinger of the conservative movement, who starts working in the 1950s and the 1960s. And this is he's most famous for being the founding editor of National Review, in which he says that the purpose of National Review is to stand athwart history yelling stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so, and have no patience to those who so urge it, right? He also works with students to articulate with the Young Americans for Freedom, and kind of a contrast to the Port Huron Statement, which we'll talk about next class when we talk about the anti-war movement. 5 principles of like the conservative movement. Individual freedom and the right of governing originate with God. Political freedom is impossible without economic freedom. They call for limited government and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So if it's not in the Constitution, the government doesn't have the right to do that. A free market system should be preferred about all others, and that communism must not just simply be contained, right? This is no longer containment under Truman or Eisenhower, right? They must be defeated, right? And so this anti-communism becomes that Johnson and Kennedy are not strong enough anti-communists, and so you have this anti-communism becomes this organizing principle of National Review and the conservative movement. But in addition, right, specifically the question of civil rights becomes an organizing principle. In his National Review, right, in an issue from August 24th, 1957, an unsigned editorial appears, which is an editorial from like the editorial board of the National Review that says, "Why the South must prevail." The central question that emerges, and it is not a parliamentary question or a question that is answered merely by consulting a catalog of rights of American citizens born equal, is whether the white community in the South is entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally in areas in which it does not predominate numerically. The sobering answer is yes. The white community is so entitled because for the time being, it is the advanced race. It is not easy. It is unpleasant to adduce statistics evidencing the median cultural superiority of white over Negro, but it is a fact that obtrudes one cannot be hidden by ever so busy egalitarians and anthropologists. The question as far as the white community is concerned is whether the claims of civilization supersede those of universal suffrage. The British believe they do and acted accordingly in Kenya, where the choice was dramatically between one civilization and barbarism, and elsewhere. The South, where the conflict is by no means dramatic as in Kenya, nevertheless perceives important qualitative differences between its cultures and the Negroes and intends to assert its own. National Review believes that the South's premises are correct. If the majority wills what is socially atavistic, then the thwart the majority may be, though undemocratic, enlightened. It is more important for any community anywhere in the world to affirm and live by civilized standards, right? This editorial is basically calling for a system of racial apartheid, right? That even in cases where numerically that white civilization in the South, even if it is numerically declined, right, they should hold all the power, right? This editorial was written by William F. Buckley Jr. It was unsigned. He had never in his life disavowed or retracted this editorial, right? There's a reading of this editorial that he is not himself a racist, but he is making an overture. He is opening the doors for Southern segregationists into the conservative movement. That it's not just anti-communism, that there is a kind of like a racial hierarchy here. So what we're going to look at is actually thinking about some of the different movement activists and groups within the civil rights movement. So this is what we're doing in class, right? We're looking at different texts from these different thinkers and activists, right? Looking at King's letter from a Birmingham jail, looking at Bayard Rustin, one of the organizers of the March on Washington, looking at Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and the Black Panther Party. We're going to do this in class, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this here. And next class, we're going to be turning to the revolutionary 60s, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. There's going to be a slightly different homework assignment that's going to be on my TBT for this. All right, I'll see you all in class.